So it was an interesting Supreme Court decision, or appeal rather, not decision. The decision has been reserved. Appeal last week about the new guidelines for personal injury claims. So basically there has been an appeal to the Supreme Court. It's ended up at the Supreme Court against the new personal injury guidelines. And the reporting that I'm referring to, or relying on rather here, is from the Irish Times. But the judges, according to counsel for the state, says that judges can depart from the personal injury guideline valuations and that they're not bound by the actual guidelines. So if they feel that the award does not do the injury justice, then lawyers for the state have told the Supreme Court they can depart from the guidelines. The senior counsel for the state fielded questions from 7 judge court, putting forward hypothetical scenarios in which judges might be entitled to make a higher award than is set out in the guidelines. Counsel said that judges were expected to follow the guidelines, but if he or she believed those figures were simply wrong, the Judicial Council Act of 2019 provides for a departure. So the circumstances will depend, or the departure from the guidelines will depend very much on the circumstances. Counsel said that a judge cannot simply throw up his hands and put in or substitute a different figure, but other things would have to be taken into account, like proportionality, and the reasons were set out and proportionality was observed. Senior counsel Mr McCullough was making submissions on the second and final day. The original case involved a lady in Waterford called Bridget Delaney. She brought an appeal in respect of her Personal Injuries Assessment Board case. So she brought a PIAB case. She's from Dungarvan. She had suffered an injury and she was awarded by the Injuries Board something like 5,000 or something. Yeah, she brought a case against Waterford City and County Council. She claimed that due to the council's negligence she fractured her ankle after she tripped and fell on a public footpath in Dungarvan on April 12, 2019. She needed medical treatment and physiotherapy. She had a walker boot for a number of weeks. She submitted an application to PIAB in June 2019. It used the guidelines to assess her claim in May 2021. And she argued that her claim should have been assessed under the guidelines predecessor, the Book of Quantum, as between 8,000 and 34,000. But in fact, she was only awarded 5,000. She argued that PIAB acted outside its powers in assessing her claim under the guidelines and breached her rights to natural and constitutional justice. And she alleges that the Judicial Council acted outside of its powers in adopting the guidelines. So it's a 7-court Supreme Court, but the question really arises, is the judgment of the court being taken away? Is it being substituted by some sort of a quango, some sort of a committee, which would be unconstitutional? So Miss Delaney's lawyers basically submit that the guidelines interfere with the independence of the courts and her rights. The Judicial Council's passing of the guidelines in March 2021 was a legislative act cloaked in a veneer of judicial action and amounted to an unconstitutional interference with judicial independence. That's what her side argues. Counsel for the state, Mr McCullough, stressed that the guidelines are not legislation due to the fact that judges can depart from them. And the judges in the Supreme Court the other day, last week, were actually putting hypothetical questions to Mr McCullough, senior counsel, as to the circumstances in which the court could depart from these guidelines. Mr Justice Murray queried if the judges of the Judicial Council had been required to engage in a legislative or quasi-legislative process. So that is the question, and the nub of the issue is, do the Injuries Board guidelines, or the guidelines for the assessing of injuries, which emanated from the Judicial Council Act, do those guidelines interfere with the independence of the courts and the claimant's rights. That is the question. The Supreme Court has reserved its judgment. It'll be interesting to see what they decide, because obviously the guidelines are hotly contested, and they have certainly brought about a reduction in the amount of money that's being awarded, quite frankly, for various personal injury claims. But clearly, if the guidelines are tested, and they are being tested here, the legality of them rather, then the Supreme Court's decision will be watched with a lot of interest by lawyers and insurance companies, and indeed claimants. Hope you find this video useful. If you do, I'd appreciate if you gave it the thumbs up down below. Thanks a lot.